Okay, so today we'll be talking about trying to better understand the social impacts that algorithmic systems have, and we'll be taking perspectives from both machine learning and mechanism design. And through most of this talk, I'll be using automated hiring as a case study through which we can actually use these dual lenses to better understand social impact. Now, why mechanism design and machine learning? Why are these two different frames useful for us in trying to understand social impact? Well, in the last several years, we've seen the rise of algorithmic systems that increasingly make decisions for important aspects of people's lives regarding their economic activity, their access to opportunity, and many more things like Uber, LinkedIn, these new algorithms for college admissions that people are starting to try to deploy. All of these incorporate aspects from both machine learning and mechanism design. In some sense, they are predictive. They take in data and they try to predict outcomes based on those predictions. But the predictions aren't the whole story. There's some amount of allocation that happens, and there's multiple agents that often interact through these platforms. And understanding their behavior, it's not sufficient to just look at prediction alone. And when I talk about social impact, I'm talking about a range of values that we have in society that we want to see implemented somehow in a system, right? So this might, the most common value that you hear of being talked about in these types of systems is fairness, but we might think of a host of other values beyond fairness that we care about implementing in algorithmic systems. And so if you want to answer the question, well, how do these complex algorithmic systems impact society? It turns out that we need to take into account lessons that come from both mechanism design and machine learning. Now, what do we get from the machine learning side of things? Well, we learn about data-driven decision-making and the sort of biases and effects that come through prediction. So we know now through years of research that if we simply apply machine learning out of the box to whatever typical prediction task you might have, there's a potential to recreate whatever existing social biases you see in the world. So to the extent that you're worried about those existing social biases, we should also be worried about recreating them through machine learning systems. We've also seen that prediction can make some of these disparities actually more salient and highlight and exacerbate them. So these are the types of concerns that machine learning asks us to keep in mind. Now, on the mechanism design side, there's a whole host of different concerns. Questions of fairness and equity have shown up in mechanism design in the past, but beyond that, we also get questions surrounding agent strategic behavior and what happens at equilibrium as systems get deployed. So this takes us beyond questions of classification and prediction. We actually have to ask, when those classifications or predictions get made and decisions are made in the world, how do people respond? What sort of incentives do we create? And what does that look like in the long run? So these are the types of questions that we're going to get into today. And we're going to do so in particular in the context of algorithms used in hiring. So there's a ton of different ways that algorithms get used in the sort of modern day to make hiring decisions. I'll give you an example of perhaps one of the most surprising or salient ones that I've come across, which is affective computing to determine hiring outcomes. So what this example looks like is a candidate will record a video in response to some interview questions, and based on attributes of that video, including their expressed emotions and their facial expression, the tone and cadence of their speech, and also, as you see, their language patterns and their choice of words, all of these get turned into signals that are run through some machine learning algorithm and are used to predict hiring outcomes, and used to make decisions actually of, should I interview this person in person or not? And these are the types of things that people can see on the recruiter side of things. So you might see candidates might be given scores, they might be ranked with respect to particular skills or competencies. It depends heavily on the platform, but many of them look like this, where behavioral data or affective computing is used to score people and to rank them and ultimately to make hiring decisions. So if you have spent any time thinking about biases in social systems, your first instinct might be, does this actually recreate biases that exist in the world? Should you expect to see hiring algorithms introduce the exact same biases that we see present in the world? And you can find tons of articles that are asking this question or trying to make this point, that you should expect hiring algorithms to be just as biased as the data from which they are built. But actually, when you look a little deeper into the people who are building these hiring algorithms, they want you to think the opposite. So these are statements from companies or articles written by companies who produce these hiring algorithms. And what their claim is something like, by using machine learning and AI, we can make unbiased, data-driven, objective decisions. And this somehow removes the bias that is in the world and increases the diversity in your choices and mitigates your bias. Right, so these seem to tell two different stories, right? One story says algorithms are just going to reproduce all the bias that we see in the world, and you shouldn't expect it to be any different. And the other story, which is told by the companies who build these tools, is actually we found processes, we found ways of training machine learning systems that actually remove bias or mitigate bias. So you might look at these two stories and say, actually, it's not clear to me a priori which one of them is true. And that was sort of my perspective when I started to look at these systems. And so the questions I wanted to ask really are, what can we learn by applying this lens of machine learning? Right? How do we take into account where this data is coming from? How do we take into account what these firms actually seem to predict? And actually, if we know a little bit about their practices, how do the constraints that they put on their machine learning systems impact the potential to propagate bias? And this is a much longer conversation that I'm not going to spend too much time on today. One thing that might be interesting for this audience is what actually happens in practice in a lot of these firms, and especially ones that seek to operate in the United States, which is where discrimination laws seem to be somewhat enforced. And so the quick summary of really what they do is something what they call algorithmic debiasing. And basically it's an acknowledgement that, yes, we expect to see some amount of bias present in the data, but actually what we're going to do is add constraints to the models and to our training procedures that remove bias in some way. And so the constraint that they try to follow comes from the late 70s in the United States, which basically says if you have two different groups, say men and women, the selection rates between those two groups should be approximately equal. And the law explicitly defines, along what attributes those groups are defined. But basically what the law says is you should have approximately equal selection rates. Now, what these firms will end up doing then is you train a model and you test to see, you test for discrimination. So you test to see if this constraint is violated. And if it is, you simply remove features from the model or you downweight them in some way and retrain the model until you get one that actually satisfies this test. So this tells us something quite interesting about what's going on in practice, right? One, in practice, they actually are finding that biases exist in the data to the extent that they have to correct them. The other thing that it tells us is that this is one particular notion of fairness or of discrimination. And actually, this particular training procedure doesn't handle other discriminatory behaviors that might be present in the system. And so this is sort of a thing to keep in mind as people consider future regulation in this space. And the final thing I'll say here is that there's an interesting phenomenon created by discrimination law in the United States, which basically says that all else equal, if you can come up with a selection procedure or an algorithm in this case, that is roughly as accurate, but actually minimizes disparities in selection rates, you have an obligation to use it. So what this says is that because we can use machine learning techniques to somewhat easily satisfy these constraints at little cost to something like accuracy, there might actually be an affirmative obligation for firms to start using them. So again, this is looking deeper into the sort of machine learning side of algorithmic hiring is a bit of a longer conversation, but I just wanted to give you a taste of sort of what are the things that we can get out of applying a machine learning lens to algorithmic hiring. And so this lens tells us part of the story, right? It tells us a little bit about discrimination. It tells us something about bias in the data. But you could ask the question, is this actually the whole story? As we start to see algorithmic hiring used throughout certain industries, what other effects are we going to see? What is the larger picture behind this? And so the focus in the remainder of this talk is really going to be about using the lens of mechanism design to think about the sort of societal and game theoretic effects of introducing something like algorithmic hiring into the world. And in particular, the concern that I want to raise to you and that I want to think about today is what I'll call algorithmic monoculture. Okay? So first of all, what do I even mean by monoculture? Where does that word come from? Well, it's actually a term that comes from agriculture, and it refers to the phenomenon of focusing or being too dependent on one particular crop or family of crops. And actually, monoculture is something that, as traditionally formulated, can be sort of precisely technically formulated. If I could get the slides to advance. Okay, great. So what is the concern of monoculture? So in this picture, I have two separate worlds shown. On the left side, you have a world where everybody grows a different crop. And on the right side, you have a world where everybody grows the same crop. And I've annotated each of these crops with its own, let's say, success probability. So what's the probability that it'll make it through the season? And you'll notice that on the right-hand side, I've chosen the best crop for my sort of monocultural world. So, one of these crops has a 0.9 success probability, and I've decided, well, that sounds like a pretty good success probability. I'm going to just plant that single plant everywhere. But the concern with monoculture is something like the following. On the left-hand side, all of these crops are independent. So let's say, what we're worried about is susceptibility to different viruses. On the left-hand side, each plant has a varying degree of robustness to those viruses, but they're actually robust to different viruses. So if one of them dies, that's independent from the rest of them dying. And so the probability that all my crops die in this left-hand world is very, very low, right? At least one of them is probably going to make it. But on the right-hand world, even though I've chosen the best possible crop to plant everywhere, what this has done is it's created a vulnerability. And what that vulnerability is correlated failure. So each plant individually is likely to survive, but there's some small chance of a catastrophic event occurring where I have all my crops get wiped out. Okay, so this is sort of the concern behind monoculture, and it's not unique to agriculture. It actually shows up in, for instance, computer security. That if all of us are using the same operating system, and that operating system has a vulnerability, now all of us are susceptible. Okay, so this is the concern in general about monoculture. Now, the question that I want to ask here is, where do algorithms fit in? Right? Why am I talking about this in the context of algorithmic decision making? And the reason I think algorithmic decision making is an appropriate place to discuss monoculture is because we're starting to see algorithmic systems that make decisions on our behalf, but are somehow correlated in some sense across decision makers. So, one classic example of this, which has been going on for a long time, is credit scoring. Right? There are lots of different banks you might be able to go to ask for a loan, but in practice, all of them will use the same credit score to evaluate you. So there's a sort of monoculture in decision making there, where people evaluate risk the same way, people evaluate other people the same way. And the same thing is starting to happen in hiring decisions, where a single vendor will sell the same hiring algorithm to multiple businesses in the same industry. So let's say you want a job at a call center. If they're all using the same resume screener, or they're all using the same hiring assessment, then you don't have an independent chance of getting hired at each one. Actually, the chance that if you get denied or rejected from one of them, you're likely to also get rejected from the rest of them. And so this creates some individual level concerns, right? As an individual, if this algorithm makes a mistake on me in some way, right? Maybe it misreads my resume. Is that going to follow me around from employer to employer? And actually, this sort of explicitly happens in some of these hiring assessments. So in this example here, there's a firm that as parts of their terms of service, they actually prevent you from taking their test more than once a year, right? And so what that means is if you apply to a company and you fail that test, you actually can't apply back for another year. And you also can't apply to other companies that use the same test. So as an individual, you end up just being locked out of the market altogether because of your performance on one particular assessment. So to the extent that that was a mistake, you had a bad day, it didn't accurately reflect your ability to do the job, you're out of luck. You won't actually be able to continue to apply to those types of jobs. And this gets to the main argument in favor of algorithmic decision making. Basically, the counter argument to the point I just made about individual level concerns is, yes, individuals we might make mistakes on individuals, but actually because we are using more accurate decision making, right? Because these algorithms are in some sense, or in some way, more accurate than the human decision makers they were replacing. Somehow this has to be good for social welfare. So that's the argument. We trade off these individual level issues and the likelihood of individuals getting locked out of the market against this increased social welfare and better aggregate decision making. And to jump to the main result that we'll be trying to work up to today, this argument is actually false. That somehow, if we correlate decision making, even if we have better decision making, somehow that can decrease social welfare. Okay, so that's the sort of idea of where we're going to be heading today. And what I'm going to try to do is set up a model for you in which it's clear that this happens. Okay, but this is the main result. Better decision making can decrease social welfare if these decisions are correlated. And this is precisely this issue of algorithmic monoculture that we started with. Okay, so to set this up for you, we're going to introduce a model. Okay, and we're going to analyze this model in a game theoretic setting. So the general form of this model will be something like the following. There are k different firms, and there are n candidates. And each of those candidates has some utility xi associated with them. Now, each of those firms wants to hire one candidate, right? So k out of those n candidates are going to get hired. And the way that hiring works in this model is the following. Each firm produces a ranking over all the candidates. Okay, so each candidate has a list from 1 to n of their favorite candidates. And in some random order, the firms will start to select their favorite remaining candidate. So the first firm that gets to select will get their first choice candidate. The second firm will get their first choice as long as that person hasn't already been taken by the previous firm, and so on. Okay. And when I said each firm will form a ranking, I'm going to introduce two options for inducing noisy rankings over the candidates. One is that they'll just hire a human decision maker, and that human decision maker, completely independently from anyone else, will form a noisy ranking over the n candidates. The second option that they have is to purchase an algorithm from some vendor, and that will induce a common ranking over all the candidates. So if two different firms purchase the algorithm, they will get back the exact same ranking over the candidates. Okay, is that clear so far? Please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Okay, great. So this is it. This is the model. And just to run through a quick example of what this will look like, suppose we have these four firms. The first firm and the third firm are choosing to use the algorithm. Firms 2 and 4 are using independent human decision makers just to look at resumes. So each is going to form a ranking. So the algorithmic ranking looks like this. This human is going to make a different ranking. Notice that firm 3 gets the same ranking as firm 1 because they both chose to use this algorithmic ranking. And the fourth firm gets a totally different ranking altogether because all these humans in this model are independent. Okay, and so the way that that the actual selection would work, let's say this is a random ordering over the firms. The first firm is going to choose their favorite candidate. second firm also gets to choose their favorite candidate or candidate. For firm 3, their favorite candidate is already taken, so instead they'll get their second favorite candidate. And same thing for firm 4. Their favorite candidate is taken, so they'll get the next one on their list. Okay, so this is just a simple model of how selection works when you have multiple firms making decisions. And now I have to tell you a little bit about where these rankings come from, right? Why do they all have different rankings, and how is that related to the ground truth? Because remember, these candidates all do have some utilities associated with them. What is the relationship between those utilities and the actual ranking? And so in the abstract, we're going to think about families of distributions over perturbations as our sort of families of ranking. And what we want to do is parameterize them by their accuracy, which I'll call theta. So, larger theta means more accurate. And I'll have 3 sort of general conditions on what it means for a ranking family to satisfy this definition. And we'll look into a couple actual concrete models of ranking that satisfy these. Okay, so the first condition that we want is that we want sort of differentiability and continuity. So what this means is every permutation over the candidates has some probability associated with it under this noisy ranking model. And I want those probabilities simply to just vary continuously or smoothly as I increase or decrease the accuracy theta. Okay, the next condition I want is that asymptotically this ranking family is optimal. So as my accuracy increases to infinity, I should get back the correct ordering of the candidates with probability 1. Okay, and the final constraint that I want is a little bit more complex, and I'll call it monotonicity. Essentially what I want is that as theta increases, or as the accuracy increases, in expectation, the top ranked candidate that I get should increase or should improve. Okay, and the constraint that I want to impose is that this should be true even with any subset of candidates removed. And we'll see why this will become important. But it turns out these are sort of fairly natural properties to ask out of a family of ranking models. And a couple examples of models that satisfy this are the Mallows model and random utility models. So what is the Mallows model? It just says the probability of a permutation is sort of proportional in some sense to the number of inversions between that permutation and the true ordering. Okay, and that proportionality goes through some accuracy parameter theta, which is raised to the power negative number of inversions. So basically the way you should think of the Mallows model is fewer inversions means more likely, and permutations that have the same number of inversions as each other are equally likely. Okay, so that's the Mallows model, and it turns out it satisfies all of those constraints that I set out in the definition. The second family of models we'll think about are what's known as random utility models, which just says if you have some underlying utility for these candidates, add noise to them, add noise to those underlying utilities, and then rank the noisy version. So for instance, you could say, take all of my candidates, add some Gaussian noise to them, and then rank the perturbed utilities of those candidates. That again produces a family over ranking models, which is parameterized by this accuracy parameter. So if you think about it, as theta increases, the effect of this noise is going to decrease. And eventually we'll get to a point where the perturbed candidate values are actually just equal or almost equal to the original values. Okay, so these are two families of ranking models that will satisfy the definitions that I'd put out on the previous slide. Okay, any questions on this so far? Okay, great. So before we get into this, just to relate this back to the model of selection, all we're saying is, when these firms create rankings over the candidates, they will be using, let's say they're like those, where does that ranking actually come from? Maybe it's sampled from the Mallows model distribution, maybe it's sampled from a random utility model distribution. I'm going to be agnostic for now as to exactly what the underlying ranking model is, but it could be any one of these, okay? And that's sort of what we'll explore is going to be the properties of different ranking models. And the two key properties I'm going to need to prove the result that we're going to get to are the following. The first is that under that ranking model, there's a preference, what I'll call a preference for the first position. And what that says is, if you sample two permutations from your ranking model, let's say they disagree in the first position. Okay, so to put it concretely, let's say I hire two people to make me, to rank all the candidates for me. And I get back two different rankings. And let's say they disagree on who's at the top of that ranking. Okay. The question that I'm asking here is, given that disagreement, should I still, in expectation, prefer the best person according to either of those rankings, as opposed to the second best person according to the ranking? Okay, so given disagreement in that top position, should I still prefer the first position over the second position? And I'll give you a little bit of intuition for what that would look like in a second. The second property is a little bit more intuitive, and it's just a preference for weaker competition. And so what that means is, and I'll explain this notation a little bit. So pi sub 1 is the best person according to the permutation pi. And when I say parentheses minus sigma sub 1, what I'm saying is with the top candidate according to sigma already removed. So let's say someone has already hired the top person according to sigma, so you have to remove them from your permutation. Given that, who is the best remaining candidate? That's what that notation in there is saying. Now, what this preference for weaker competition is saying is, given that somebody gets to choose before you, right? You're second in line to make a choice. Would you rather have the person before you be more accurate or less accurate? Okay, and so you might assume that the natural preference there is, well, I'd rather have my competition be worse. Okay? I'd rather have the person who selects someone before me be worse at selecting, because the intuition is that there will be better candidates remaining for me when I get to go second. Okay, so this preference for weaker competition is sort of the intuitive property that you would expect there. This preference for the first position, though, let me try to give you a little bit of intuition for when that might even be true and what that would imply. So I'll give you a concrete example that says, let's say we have two firms and there are three candidates and we're hiring in a fixed order. Okay, the firms get to either choose as before between getting this human ranking or an algorithmic ranking. Okay? And we'll assume that the algorithm is more accurate than the human. So what should these firms do? Well, the first firm should always use the algorithm because it is more accurate. But the question is, what should firm 2 do, right? Should they use the algorithm and get back the same ranking as the previous firm, or should they get an independent ranking, which is less accurate, but at least it's independent? Okay, so this sort of intuition is actually going to underpin a lot of what we discussed today. So I want to make sure we're clear on this. The theorem here, and the thing that may be surprising, is that there are certain ranking models under which you should, for any sort of accuracy level of a human, there's a slightly more accurate algorithm such that you should always strictly prefer independence over accuracy. Okay, so given that firm 1 is using the algorithm, firm 2 should always strictly prefer to use an independent, even though less accurate, ranking mechanism. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second just to see if there are questions, because this is going to be a key point that we're going to refer back to later. The key point here is there's value, of course, to accuracy, but it turns out that there's also value to independence in this sort of competitive scenario. Any questions on that? Okay, great. So this is what gives us our preference for the first position. If you have a preference for independence, this sort of leads to the property that we saw on the previous slide, and I'll show you why this becomes useful. Let me give you a little more intuition for what this would mean, though. Let's say you have a hiring committee, and on Monday you convene this committee and you rank all your candidates and you make an offer to the best one. Now, suppose that candidate rejects your offer. Let's say you have two options now. You can either go down the list on this ranking and take the second best person, or you could convene a new committee altogether, have them rank the candidates and choose their favorite. Okay, which of those things should you do? Should you use the same ranking, or should you get a new ranking altogether? And this preference for the first position, or this preference for independence, actually says that in this situation, it would strictly be better to convene a new committee and do this re-ranking, as opposed to simply going down your list, right? So this might seem a little counterintuitive, right? Why should this be any different? After all, these rankings are all equally accurate. Why would it matter that you going further down the list versus getting a new ranking altogether? Okay, so this is the sort of counterintuitive property here. The interesting thing is that this property actually is true for many natural ranking models, including the Mallows model, including some of these random utility models. It's an interesting sort of phenomenon. We'll get later in this talk, we'll look a little bit into why this is true. But with this intuition and with this property, I want to try to get into our main result a little bit. So the main theorem here is the following. If you have one of these ranking families, and it satisfies both of these properties that I'd asked for, this preference for the first position and this preference for weaker competition. Under these assumptions, if you have such a ranking model, then the theorem is, no matter how, for any accuracy level of the human decision maker, there's always a slightly more accurate algorithm that leads to the following two properties. At equilibrium, and I'm talking about a pure Nash equilibrium here, both of the firms involved, so we're going to think about the two-firm version of this, both of the firms involved choose to use the algorithmic ranking. But actually, if they were both forced to choose independent human evaluators instead, social welfare would be higher. Okay, so somehow both firms are going to rationally choose to use this algorithm, and this ends up decreasing social welfare. And because these firms are all symmetric, it also individually decreases each of their welfare. Okay, so this main theorem is sort of a version of Bayes' paradox in a sense, where introducing a better option somehow leads to lower welfare. So if you haven't seen it, Bayes' paradox just says we have a congestion game and people are trying to get from S to T. In the initial network here, people will incur a cost of 1.5 because they'll equally split over the two branches. But actually, if we add a zero cost edge from V to W, everyone will take the path that goes from S to V and then V to W and W to T. And somehow that leads to worse outcomes for everyone, despite it being the rational choice. So in a sense, this is a version of this Bayes' paradox that says, by introducing a new option, this more accurate algorithm, somehow you've decreased social welfare, even though everybody's making rational choices. Okay, and so I'm going to try to get into the proof sketch here. And I'm going to try to keep this light on notation. And so here are the definitions that we're going to need. So the first definition is use of S for either S is equal to A or H of the two accuracy parameters. And this is just going to be the utility of the person who's randomly selected to move first, given these two accuracy parameters. I see there's a, so the point was, in the paradox, it is still a dominant strategy to use the socially worst strategy. And this is exactly what we're going to find in this example. So in this monocultural setting, what I'm going to show is that it is a dominant strategy to use the algorithmic ranking, even though it is socially worse than everybody using the human ranking. Okay, right. So I'm going to define use of S to be the utility of the firm that gets to choose first, right? If they use the algorithm, they'll get use of A. If they use the human, they get use of H. Okay. Similarly, I'm going to define U with these two S parameters as being the utility of the second mover. So for instance, what is the utility if you're using strategy S2, given that the person who went before you uses strategy S1? Okay, so those are the two utility definitions we're going to have. Oh, there's a typo here. This W should be S1, S2 as well. But I'm going to use W to denote social welfare, which says, for these two strategies that the two players are playing, what is the expected social welfare? Okay. And now the formal statement that I want somehow is that at equilibrium, or we want to show that welfare is higher if both firms were to use H as opposed to if both firms use A. But somehow at equilibrium, both firms still end up choosing A. And in fact, we'll end up showing that it is a dominant strategy for both of them to choose A. Okay, so is there any questions on our objective here?
Manish, I might have missed it, but did you define the social welfare?
Oh, good question. So social welfare is simply going to be the sum of the utilities for everyone involved.
Okay, what are the utilities?
So the utilities, okay, good question. So each candidate has some XI associated with them, right? An underlying quality or value. I'm just going to add those up for all the candidates who got selected.
So all the candidates are going to be selected by one of the firms?
No,
like
so
if they're symmetric.
Right.
I'm kind of missing something.
So in the setup, there are N candidates, or there are N candidates and 2 firms. So only 2 candidates are going to get selected.
Okay.
So social welfare is just going to be the utilities of those 2 candidates.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay, and it's symmetric, so the firms are all the same.
Yeah. Okay, so like maximizing social welfare will be hiring the top 2.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter which.
It doesn't matter which firm gets
which one. Okay.
Exactly. And so, yeah, we don't care which firm gets which one. We're still going to end up with higher social welfare under the world where both use H as opposed to where both use A. Okay. So these are basically, we need to show that there exists accuracy parameters that satisfy these constraints, right? The algorithm is more accurate. Social welfare is worse when both firms use the algorithm, but at equilibrium, they still both choose to use the algorithm. Okay, now the first claim that I'm going to make is regarding our preference for the first position, which simply, if you remember, said, given that two rankings disagree in the first position, you should still prefer the first position over the second position. Okay. Now, my claim is that this is essentially the same thing as saying, given that the human and algorithm are equally accurate, if your competitor gets to go before you and they use the algorithm, you should prefer independence. So for equally accurate algorithm and human, you should prefer independence. Okay. So this, again, this is not true for all ranking models, and we're going to get into a little bit about when this is true, but it turns out it's actually true for some very natural models, which sort of turns out to be an interesting fact about the world. But this is the starting point that we're going to leverage. For equally accurate human and algorithm rankings, you should prefer independence. Okay.
Can I ask a question about the last statement? So we assume that even the algorithm is not like totally accurate, right? Like
correct.
Okay.
Right, exactly. So each of them is going to have some level of accuracy, and our goal is going to be to show that if you tell me how accurate the human is, I can give you sort of a range of values for algorithm accuracy that leads to this Bayes paradox type situation happening. Okay, so now you asked what welfare looks like. So the next claim that I'm going to make is something like, for sufficiently accurate algorithm, right? As this sort of accuracy of the algorithm goes to infinity, eventually there's going to be a point where it's just obviously a dominant strategy for both firms to use the algorithm. Okay, and you can think of this as coming from our monotonicity property, that basically in our sort of asymptotic optimality. I'm just saying, there exists large enough algorithm accuracy such that it's obviously rational for both firms to choose using the algorithm. And I claim that this is sort of the right way to write out social welfare, which just says it is the utility of the firm that goes first plus the utility of the firm that goes second. Okay. Okay, so for sufficiently large algorithm accuracy, this is what social welfare looks like. Now, as I start to lower that accuracy down further and further, what starts to happen, right? What happens to social welfare? Well, the first thing we should observe is that as theta A drops to theta H, basically using the algorithm becomes the same as using the human if you get to choose first, because eventually once these have identical accuracies, use of A should just sort of converge to use of H. Okay, so that's the first piece of it. But the second piece is slightly more interesting, which says that as the algorithm accuracy starts to drop, eventually there's going to be a point where the second term, right, the value of going second, you should strictly prefer to use the human over the algorithm. This is what our preference for independence, our preference for the first position was telling us, that once these things start to become roughly as equal or even exactly as equal or as accurate as each other, you should prefer independence. Okay, so we have these two terms here, and we know that as we drop down the accuracy of the algorithm, we know where the first term is going. It's going to converge to this use of H, and we actually know that the second term is going to drop below use of AH, or the value of using the human after someone has already used the algorithm. Okay, and so this, again, this comes from our assumption, or this sort of property of ranking models, that there's a preference for the first position. And so this may look like a lot, but it's really just sort of the same equation written twice. At the top, we say, when theta A was very large, using the algorithm was the best response in some sense, right? You would be better off, given that your competitor is using the algorithm, you're better off also using the algorithm for sufficiently large algorithm accuracy. But what we're saying at the bottom here is the opposite is true once the algorithm accuracy drops low enough, right? Once, let's say once they get to the same point, we found from the previous slide that it's actually the better response is to use the human decision maker. Okay, so somehow as this algorithm accuracy drops, your decision flips somewhere along the way. Okay.
Yep. Here in both of the inequalities, the right side is like the first chooses the human decider, and then the other assumes that the first one chose the algorithm and then prefers the human?
Good question. So what the right-hand side is saying is that given that your competitor is using the algorithm, what is your expected utility? And like really what I should have done to make this more clear actually is if you put a half in front of all of these, it sort of makes a little more sense. And here's where that comes from. With probability 50%, you get to go first, right? So if you're using the human decision maker, you get that use of H. That's with probability 50%. With the other 50% probability, you go second. And so given that your competitor is using the algorithm, you get whatever comes after that.
So anyway, we assume that the competitor is using the algorithm.
Yeah, and it turns out that basically the piece that I'm not showing you here is that if you are using the human, it is always going to be a strictly dominant strategy for your competitor to use the algorithm. So basically you should always assume if you are going to use the human, you should assume that your competitor is going to use the algorithm. That's the sort of why this becomes a dominant strategy argument eventually. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so right, I was hiding a little bit there, but basically the right-hand side is saying, what is the expected value of you responding by using the human? Okay, and so as we said, for large enough theta sub A, using the algorithm is still the best response. As it drops all the way down to theta sub H, actually H becomes the best response. Okay, and so what that says is there has to be some, by a continuity argument, there has to be some point in the middle where you're actually indifferent between the two. Okay, so there's a point in the middle, I'll call that theta A star, where basically you're indifferent as in your best response to someone else using the algorithm, right? And we should sort of expect this to happen, right? There should be some point at which you are indifferent between the two strategies, given that, for some values you prefer A, and then for smaller values of theta A, you prefer H. Okay, so does the argument here make sense so far? Cool. Okay, so again, by this sort of differentiability assumption that we made, there's some point at which you are indifferent. Okay, and I'm going to use this point at which you are indifferent and argue that, okay, here's sort of where we're going with this. So the plan is to show that at this particular value, theta A star, both firms using the algorithm as an equilibrium, but welfare would actually be higher if both used H. Okay, so I haven't quite got to your question about making it a dominant strategy equilibrium or even strictly dominant. Basically, the answer is going to be, once we get to this point, if you sort of perturb things up a little bit, you'll get exactly that value. But the plan for today is we're just going to show at this value where you're indifferent, both firms using the algorithm is an equilibrium, but welfare would be higher if they actually just would be strictly higher if they both used H instead. Okay. And so we're going to start with the following observation. This left-hand side here, right, which is sort of the value of using the algorithm, is actually equal to the social welfare if both firms use the algorithm, right? Because basically you get the utility that comes from the first firm using the algorithm plus the utility that comes from the second firm using the algorithm. Okay, so this is social welfare. And so I'm just going to plug that in and say, okay, the welfare, make the left-hand side equal to the welfare, the right-hand side stays the same. Okay, but now we have a slightly different expression for social welfare. And now I've copied this from the previous slide, and by definition, I can also write out the social welfare if both firms had instead decided to use human decision makers. Okay, and this is just sort of the definition. The first firm uses the human, the second firm also uses the human. Okay, and now you see that the first terms cancel out, and we're just left with the comparison between these two quantities, right? Essentially, we're asking the question: you're going to go second. Would you rather your competitor use the algorithm, or would you rather your competitor use a human? And remember, by assumption, the algorithm is more accurate than the human. Right, so we're asking the question, would you rather compete against a more accurate opponent, or would you rather compete against a less accurate opponent? And of course, again, this is a sort of, this preference for weaker competition that we initially started with would tell us you'd rather compete against a less accurate opponent. And so this leads us to our conclusion, right? We said that at this theta A star, both firms using the algorithm was an equilibrium, but it actually turns out that both firms using the human has strictly larger welfare. Okay, and just to wrap this up visually, here's sort of what this actually looks like if you were to plot it out. So these regions represent different equilibria. So when theta H is much larger than theta A, both firms will decide to use the human. When theta A is much larger, both firms will decide to use the algorithm. There's a region in the middle where there are multiple equilibria, which we're not going to worry about too much now. But the interesting region here is this shaded area. Okay, and in this shaded area, you have a region which is exactly the one that we described, where at equilibrium, we're still in this AA region. Both firms are going to choose to use the algorithm, but this is exactly the region where there would be higher welfare if both firms chose to use A instead, or choose to use the human instead. Okay, the question, can I explain why using both firms using the algorithm is an equilibrium? Yes, so the point here is by definition of theta star, you're indifferent between responding as with the algorithm or responding using the human. Essentially, those give you identical utilities. So given that your competitor is using the algorithm, it is a best response for you to also use the algorithm. Now, I said, given that your competitor is using the algorithm, it turns out that if they're instead using the human, they are also now indifferent between using the human and the algorithm. So symmetrically, their best response is also to use the algorithm. And the final piece of it is that if both firms are using the human, each one of them individually has a strict incentive to instead use the algorithm. And that's simply because there's no cost to dependence anymore, right? If both firms are using the human, you'd be better off using the strictly better strategy, given that it's not correlated with anyone else's decision making. So, right, that piece of the argument is required to say that both firms using the algorithm is in fact an equilibrium. Okay. I think we're a little tight on time, actually, and I don't want to cut into questions if there are questions. So I'm just going to briefly go through. I told you I'd tell you, does this preference for the first position actually show up in reasonable ranking distributions, right? So, okay, recall we needed these two conditions to hold. It turns out for this Mallows model, the answer is yes. You can provably for any sort of, the Mallows model is independent of the underlying candidate values. It turns out those don't matter. These conditions are always going to hold for the Mallows model. We also talked about random utility models. The answer is actually, it's somewhat complicated. And the answer is sometimes, but not always. And this is sort of what I think might be interesting to people here if you're considering thinking more about this problem. I can tell you that if we have three candidates and I add either like Gaussian or Laplacian noise to them, I can prove to you that this condition holds, but I actually don't know of a better proof than actually just like writing out the joint distribution and doing a lot of integrals. So that's sort of the one piece of it. It turns out you actually can't extend this in general. And I can give you examples of random utility models that violate both of these conditions. They're somewhat pathological in nature. And so we could think about, actually experiment, like empirically testing these. I could draw candidates from a distribution, I could perturb their values, and I could just ask the question, do they exhibit this preference for the first position, right? Or in other words, given that these things are equally accurate, do I have a preference for using the human versus the algorithm? And the answer is things get a little strange. So, for three candidates, all of these distributions, basically, as long as these lines stay above 0, that means that there's a preference for the first position. And so you can see in these first two plots, these lines always stay above 0. But it actually turns out something weird happens as you add more candidates. Laplacian noise, which is like a little bit more heavy-tailed compared to Gaussian, actually ends up in this regime where preference for independence doesn't hold. And so figuring out why that is, and sort of what the implications are, when would this be a reasonable assumption to have about ranking models, is actually quite interesting as an open direction. There's more extensions you can think of. What if I have proved you a theorem with only 2 firms? You could ask about more than 2 firms. You could also ask this question in the context of classification as opposed to ranking. And then there's this question about this sort of preference for independence when it doesn't hold, and what that says about monoculture. I'm going to skip this last piece, jump to the end, and just say thanks so much for all your time today, and looking forward to taking any questions.